We don't have much ground to cover here, folks, today with James. James chapter 3 is one of the shorter chapters in James. But I do want to circle back and just recap some stuff from last week, particularly around the favoritism that we talked about in James chapter 2 and care of the poor. And we had a pretty robust conversation. A lot of different opinions were flying around, interpretations of James. And we talked about people in their station and how everybody, and I think it was shared a lot that everybody has the ability to rise up out of their station or their circumstance. So the impression that I was left with, that I was pondering, was that if someone is born in a really, one might say, someone unmuted themselves. If someone's born in the slums of Mumbai, that they have the same opportunity that I had being born in South Georgia. And I think there's a danger in that thought process that James, I think, was trying to address, that very reality that in some cases the circumstances of folks really constantly pull them back, whether they be poverty, family situations, a child born, one of my good friends born into a meth lab scenario and had to be pulled out of that by adoption into their adopted family. Had that not happened, I don't think he would have had the same chances and opportunities that he had he not been adopted. So I just say that to us because I think the question we have to ask ourselves before we start drawing conclusions about other people and thinking that we assume everybody has the same opportunities we do is, how might I understand their circumstance? And another way that we can look at, particularly around what James, I think, was encouraging his audience to do, is put yourself in their shoes. And do you really think you'd have better opportunities than they had? And I think that's the great dilemma that we have to ponder before we jump to conclusions. Now, that is all take away from our commentary. That was just what I was left wrestling with. And I think it's important to state that we have to be careful and cautious. And sometimes I think we jump to conclusions when the better question we should be asking is, how might I understand this more fully? Or how might I understand your perspective more fully, than to assume that we have it sorted out. And I think that's at the heart of what James is talking about. And that's a good segue into chapter 3, which the whole first part of chapter 3 deals with how our speech and how we use our tongue. What do we say? What do we do? This is the great conundrum of James. He cares deeply about what we say and what we do. You know, Martin Luther. Yes.
I'm sorry. I thought you'd stop.
No, let me unpack this, Patty Peacock, if you don't mind, and then we'll pause. I'm just going to do verses 1 through 12, and then let me.
Well, this has to do with chapter 2.
Okay, come on back to me then. Tell me what you're thinking.
Just before we move on from 2 to 3, I think also that in addition to what the words mean on the obvious way the words mean, I think underneath the discussion of the rich and the poor has a lot to do with humility and appreciation for what we have, what God gives us, and because it talks a lot about the poor person representing the one God gives a lot of gifts to, and the rich person being unappreciative of those gifts and reliant on their wealth. And yet the opposite side of that, what the entreaty that was put at the end of that I think has to do with having proper humility for your and appreciation for whatever your station is. The poor person may seem to have more humility than the rich person, but is more appreciative of what God's provided. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay, Deborah.
When I was looking at some of this, dealing with the partiality, I thought they were dealing with the partiality like within the group, like within the church, which would have been a home church at the time. Like, don't kiss up to the rich people any more than you would to, the poor person. That within the worship community, all were equal. I didn't really think it applied too much to outside of that.
No, I actually think it applies to the larger community in which this church resides, not just the physical little home church community, but the larger synagogue would probably been a synagogue culture, as Paul was working inside of. It would have been a very large gathering of people, and James, very much like the prophet, speaking to the larger systematic stuff going on in the larger society. I think if we pigeonhole it just to the church community, I think we're missing a huge part of James.
But the thing is, by religious community, I also meant the Jewish community at the time, not just the little church, but the Jewish community. I mean, outside of that, they had no control really. But I was just thinking, it just was in with that within the synagogue and within the home church.
I think it's even bigger than the synagogue culture, and here's why. For James, it's living out your faith and impacting that larger world. Another way of putting it, for James, the whole entire context in which that church resides is a mission field, and we have some responsibility to the larger systems of the society in which we reside, and a responsibility to bring to bear the gospel on that. So I do think he is speaking to not just what he's seeing and observing in the church and in the synagogue life, in that microcosm, but also in the macro, larger environment that is his community. Now, I will say, Deborah, that scholarship can be divided on this point. I tend to lean towards the macro. There are some who will draw a line with James in saying that he is speaking to a synagogue, maybe a couple hundred people at most, and he's only focused on them. And then there's a larger scholarship that says it's the whole corpus of where that church resides. So, that's food for fodder. But nonetheless, I think there's an interesting conversation there to be had around a couple things around the way the rich, and this is what James is getting at, and it's meant to make, if anybody's uncomfortable, that's good. That means we're really embodying what James, I think, wants. And that is, how do rich understand the poor? What are our priorities, as Patty spoke to? How do we live our life glorifying God with all that we have from a place of thankfulness? And then there's the degree of humility, which is going to be picked up in chapter 3, that's needed for the sake of the gospel. So as we work through chapter 3, which is obviously the shortest chapter, or one of the shortest chapters in James, might be the shortest, I didn't count the verses in James, basically 2 parts in this chapter. I think that'll come to light. So unless there's something pressing, I think I want to dive in, and then we can always circle back. I just want to make those points clear that sometimes I think, have to step back and acknowledge where we are and just really ask the question, how might I understand blank's situation or that, before we draw conclusions, truly. And let me put it another way. Here's the thing I think James is getting at. Let me try to channel some James for you. I think James would tell you, before you talk about the homeless, go have dinner with the homeless. Go get to know the homeless. Get to understand them before you draw conclusions about them and what you think you know. And I'm guilty of that. And I think we all are, to a point. He would say, get out there and get to know them. And that's what we're going to build. And that's what chapter 4 and 5, I think, will build upon, is that, again, remember, James, faith is dead without works. You have to have works. That's the works. That's the going out stuff for James. It's building relationships. So we'll come back to that. But I think that's just food for fodder for us. So let me dive in here. I'm going to circle back and recap some things as I walk through chapter 3. I'm going to do verses 1 through 12. Again, assuming you've at least glanced at it. If not, it's okay. You'll be able to look at it as I go through it. So at the very beginning of this study, I don't know if y'all remember me, I talked about Martin Luther And Martin Luther is quoted as saying about James, about the book of James, it's a right strawy epistle. Now, part of this is because in chapter 3, James goes on the offensive against teachers and teachers, and Martin Luther will correlate that to preachers. And being a preacher himself, he took offense to this. And this was one of the main reasons that, well, not the main, but a secondary reason as to why he really thought this book shouldn't be included in the canon of Scripture, or what we call a Bible, shouldn't be included in the Bible. His main reason was because he felt like James was contradicting Paul's doctrine of justification by grace through faith. And then to add fuel for the fire, here in chapter 3, he attacks, or Martin Luther feels that he attacks teachers. When in actuality, he's probably not attacking teachers per se, but he's talking about the importance of our words. Our words have power. For James, that old nursery rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. James would probably disagree with that. For James, words do hurt. Words have power. He compares it to a fire that can grow into a forest fire. But before I get fully into that, just to go back to the central part of the letter, so there's 3 main discourses. Chapter 2, 1 through 13, against partiality, 2, 14 through 26 on faith and works, and then 3, 1 through 12 on the tongue. And that's what these verses are about. And this picks up on something that we heard in chapter 1, verse 19, let everyone be quick to listen and slow to speak. And I find that interesting, just that right there. If we just stopped there and thought about our current situation and our current world, how often are people quick to talk and slow to listen? We kind of do it backwards. And how often are we so sure about what we're saying that we assume that we're always right and everybody's wrong? I'm not saying we all do that, but you kind of hear that and you see that. I'm thinking, unless I'm living under a different rock than everybody else, or on a different rock than everybody else, pretty prevalent that people talk, and the power of language has a great deal of responsibility over language. So there's two impulses that James talks about when it relates to speech and the use of the tongue. There's an evil impulse and a good impulse. And this goes all the way back to Jewish theology. In Jewish theology, there's 2 sides of human nature, a dual capacity for righteousness and for wickedness. So James applies that, and that would have been known to his community, this evil impulse and this good impulse. So people can, or I guess you could say, according to Jewish anthropology, which is just a fancy word for the way the Jewish theology understands the person, that the righteous life is marked by one's holding the evil impulse in check, so that the good impulse leads one to do justice. So that would have been the environment James was operating in. So there's an evil impulse and a good impulse that are very important that humans have their minds wrapped around. And to make matters worse, or to complicate it, not to make matters worse, but to complicate it, when he starts talking about teachers, he almost implies that if there's multiple understandings of the faith that compete with one another, that teachers can become very dangerous if we overuse our ability to teach to drive a force so hard that we cause extreme division. And he sums that up as speech carries weight. Now, this whole idea of speech, this whole good and evil impulse, really is grounded, and this is where you get the scholarship around wisdom literature. James is wisdom literature. Maybe that's the way we should read it, more so than as an epistle. It's all based on this part of chapter 3 that they hang their exegetical hat, these scholars. And what they base it off of is how many times in Sirach, Proverbs, there is a emphasis on thinking about what you say. For example, Sirach 5:13 through 6:1. It's a whole long spiel about the use of the tongue and how important that is. In Proverbs 21:23 through 24, essentially it says that we must watch over the mouth and tongue to keep out of trouble. The proud, haughty person named scoffer acts with arrogant pride. But James will give us a little bit of an out, because he tells us that everybody makes mistakes. Not only teachers, all of us. Anyone who makes no mistakes is speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. If we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. That's in verse 2 and 3. So the teacher who speaks wisely, so now it's not so much about information, it's about wisdom, and correctly enables his or her listeners also to be wise. However, one who errs leads a whole community into error. Again, we don't just see James at work here, but we see the influence of a Jewish tradition, a Jewish ethical tradition. James' comparison to the horse's bridle and a rudder of a ship are common among pagan moralists. So the metaphor here compares the teacher's tongue to the ship's rudder, which goes where the impulse of the pilot desires. And that's my translation. Again, this evokes the Jewish doctrine of the two impulses. If the teacher's own righteous life is not in check or not righteous, we'll say, so if the life of the teacher is not righteous, then the community is at stake, and the teacher will fall short, and the community will fall short. But if the teacher speaks love and praise to God, or speaks in that vein from a great place of humility, then the community will come into a deeper understanding of who God is in their lives and be more likely to move in the right direction, if you will, move deeper into discipleship, we might call it. And then to move off of teachers and just to all of us, he talks about the tongue is fire in verse 6. And then you can kind of hearken back to chapter 2 when he said the one who shows partiality to wealthy guests and dishonors poor ones, or who offers pious blessings to the poor and refuses to alleviate their suffering, that's 2:14 through 17, they do a world of damage. One might say damaging speech does three things. It stains the body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and is itself set on fire by hell. This cosmic indictment of wrong teaching and wrong speaking is really a big deal to James, and why I said earlier that he would not agree with sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Because for James, what goes out is an indication of what's in and what you're doing inside, knowing that we're not all perfect, but how are we working on that righteous life? How are we controlling our speech? And that whole discourse, verses 7 through 12, ends with a summary that repeats the difficulty of controlling speech and then the necessity to do so. He even this whole metaphor with animals, although other animals can be domesticated, human speech resists being tamed. It's dual nature, which is reflective of dual character of human nature, means it can address God with blessing and God's creation, or God's creation with a curse. We are able to do both. We're able to bring up springs of justice, and we are able to sow seeds of injustice. We are able to speak words of love just as quickly as we are able to speak words of hatred. We can speak words of unity, or we can speak words of division. And the important thing for James is that we pause. That's where the wisdom piece sows in here. That wisdom is not about having all the right answers. It's about trusting in the God who creates us and the God who provides for us. And he asked that question in verse 11 and 12, which kind of sums the whole thing up. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brothers and sisters, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. And the importance here is, how are we, A, watching our speech? 2, how is our speech reflective of what we believe about what God invites us to consider? And 3, what do we use our speech for? 4, do we listen? Do we stop and listen before we speak? Or do we just assume that we have it all sorted out and that we have it all figured out? So for 12 verses, there's a great deal in there that can give us a lot to ponder and food for fodder. So let's do that right now. Let's talk about it. What are y'all thinking as we think about the use of the tongue and speech, this dual nature? Or put another way, how many of you want to share a story where speech hurt you? Or where speech brought you closer to God, where someone's speech moved you into a deeper understanding of maybe who God is?
I'll share a story of how one of my students took something that I said in class and remembered it and floored me, that I thought, oh, I vaguely remember saying that, but it made a huge impression on that student. And it actually relates to the virus and the COVID and the drugs that are being developed. And in my cancer lecture, I was talking about the biologicals and how those were the wave of the future, and how research was going to figure out how to use them for the benefit of mankind in ways that didn't even relate to cancer. And she said when she gave the first medication, she looked at the label and she said, oh my gosh, this is one of those drugs that Professor Lee told me about. And I didn't even remember having said it. And she said, the thing that caught me is, she said, you said, I could be wrong, but I think that this is the wave of the future. And she said, I'll never forget that. You know, so when I was reading James, I thought, wow, he's right. When you say something in front of a class, and when you have a title after your name, your words do make an impression on people, and you have no idea the impression that you're making on people.
One might say that you bear a great responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The more audience you have, although I would say that James would say everybody's speech matters, even if your audience is one person. But in our world, I have you all, at least until you hang up and walk away from me. But what I say here matters. You know, and more importantly, I think, James, and this is what we'll flesh out a little bit later in 4 and 5, as we kind of hopefully tie all these different things we're talking about through these early chapters back together, is the life that I'm displaying for you all reflective of God as I understand God, as I understand God's love for me, as James would say, is the faith that I'm expressing through my words and deeds actually reflective of what I really believe God is doing in my life. That's one way of thinking about it. And I bear a great responsibility. If I got up here and told you that you're all miserable human beings and you all just need to get over yourselves, and I meant it, which that's probably hard to take me seriously for those, if you see me on Sunday, I don't think I could do that with a straight face, but let's just say I did. That could be a, you know, as kind of a funny example. I mean, that can have a lot of effect. You know, it's just, even in my marriage, we'll say how I speak to Vanessa or how she speaks to me. And we know we're not all perfect in those. Those are always kind of a little messy, right? They're always a little messy. But words matter. Words truly matter. And that's an audience of one, either direction. So, there's a lot to consider here. And I think we Christians have a responsibility with what we say and do out in the world. It bears noting that we have a great responsibility there. Go ahead.
So, Father, to follow up on what you just said, even if your audience is as important, and for Jack and I, even more important, as the Lord has blessed us with 48 years of marriage, I have begun to realize how important it is, the tone of my voice. And how I say to him, instead of, "Good coffee, Jack," I walk to where he's going, doing his yoga. "Sweetheart, this is delicious. Thank you so much." Really from my heart. And it is really has made a difference on our relationship. Mm-hmm. I see it. I hope you see it too, honey.
Yes, dear.
But it does for me, and I see. So.
But I get in trouble more.
No. But it is so important to be just a little bit kinder to that audience of one. It does so much for yourself and for the other person.
Very much so. Very much so. And it's hard, right? So here's the other side of that, right? When we see people out in the world who say things or don't say things when they're somebody who has a captive audience and maybe has influence, what we call influence. Sometimes it's not always what they say, it's what they don't say, or it's how they say it. It is the tone. It is the words they use. Again, I mean, I think for James, he holds no apologies in saying that you have a responsibility when you're in that leadership role. And clearly, one could say that part of chapter 3 is James's rebuke of some teacher who came in and taught all the stuff about the poverty in chapter 2. So he was talking about correcting that in chapter 2, and now he's admonishing whoever came in and did that to this community. One might say that's part of what's going on here in chapter 3. Somebody who had influence walks into this community, teaches something that James completely disagrees with, fixes the teaching in chapter 2 now, talks about the importance of, you better get your ducks in a row and think about what this looks like before you get up in front of folks and talk to them. Like, your words matter. You can.
I think about Paul and the false prophets and teaching some of that. But
yeah, it's similar because Paul was most of Paul's letters, although he doesn't always explicitly say it. What he seems to be doing is cleaning up what we call super apostles that are entering into his community and teaching, and they're teaching something completely different from what he was teaching. So he's coming behind them and trying to get everybody back on his bandwagon. And you get allusions of that in each one of his letters to the churches based on the conflict that's happening in the churches around something. It's clear that some other teachers had entered into the community. And here's the irony. They probably considered themselves just as much of Christians as Paul was, and that's what's interesting about this. And where James, and what we're going to talk about, and I'll just spoil it for you, the last part of chapter 3 talks about the importance of humility and wisdom, that part of your job is to be humble and to actually listen and glean understanding before you really open your mouth and quote unquote teach. Because none of us really has all the answers. But together, this is a big important part of James, is in community, we gain a lot more than we do individually. So we have to navigate those waters, every day in Christianity today. Think how many different denominations there are. Think how many denominations go against each other publicly. Think about divisions within each denomination. Pastors getting up and saying other pastors are wrong. The bottom line is, folks, just to be very clear about this, that I am always right and they are always wrong. As long as you have that, then we can have this conversation. But all joking aside, but I mean, that's the real world we operate in. And it's funny. We think that this is so different than the early church. Like you hear people talk about, oh my goodness, the world's coming to an end because everybody's lost God. Well, if you just rewind a couple thousand years, someone might say, did they find him then? Did they have him then? Because that's just the world of humanity that God entered into. It was messy. It was chaotic. There was never this kind of golden moment in human history where there was, except in Acts, there's one moment of utopia in the Christian community where everybody was given generously to everybody and everything was beautiful. And that moment disappeared pretty quick. But in the broader world where the gospel entered into, it was chaotic as it is today. And there was as much division, difference, dissension as we all have to navigate. And I'm sure that's why Jesus told his disciple, or he never told his disciples, hey, drop your nets, follow me. We're going to get massages every Friday. We're going to get our nails done every Thursday. We're going to just kind of say a few words on Wednesday. And on Tuesday, we're going to take a nap. And on Monday, we're going to play. No, it was hard. Jesus never told him it was going to be easy. Ever, ever, ever. He never told any of us that it was going to be easy. He kicked us out. And by kicked us out, I mean kicked us out into the world. Told us to go and do certain things. And it was going to be hard. And you weren't always going to be welcomed. You weren't always going to be liked. You're going to have to learn how to get along, which the disciples had to figure out. The whole book of Acts is full of them fighting with each other over who had the right take on what Jesus said. And then Paul enters in like a hippie and messes the whole thing up and talks about the Gentiles. So I'm saying this to you kind of in a snarky way, but also in a serious way that really happened. So today, we can't really lean on our excuse that today's somehow harder than it was in the beginning. We're all living in the same kind of difficulty of spreading the gospel and living out our faith. We just have to decide to what length we will go as a broader community that is St. Luke's, as a broader Christian movement, and as individuals to share the good news, to live it out. And that's where James motivates us and also gets us to do the introspective work of developing ourselves and making sure we're aligning ourselves with God. So yeah, that's enough of that rant. Paul, go ahead.
Well, I'm loving what you're saying, but I want to ask in particular right about the very first thing he says. Many of you should not become teachers. I mean, one of the things I like about this congregation is it seems to me there's room for a range of opinion. And how are we to reconcile the kind of plurality of voices with this advice that there shouldn't be? It seems to me he's saying there are too many ideas out there, and we need to cut them back down. I don't know whether I'm misreading him, but it just seems to me he's distressed here with the plurality of views and the plurality of teachings. Whereas to me, that's something very attractive, that there's such a room for a diversity of opinion. We don't all have to agree on everything.
Yeah, I think part of it's, I don't think it's the plurality of opinions per se. I mean, here's what's made things a little weird. Now we got to talk about comparing the two communities. What they didn't have that we have is you all have, because of the Reformation, because of Martin Luther that I just quoted earlier, and Sola Scriptura, we opened up Scripture to the whole world. It's hard for us to fathom that for the better part of about 1,400 years, only a very few people had access to the Scriptures, and they would teach. You didn't have a Bible. You didn't read it. So what the Reformation did is it opened that up, and it allowed everybody to have access to Scripture. And inadvertently, the Reformers essentially moved away from what James, and this is why one of the reasons why Martin Luther has a problem with James, moved away from James and kind of that early church tradition of a very few teachers and a whole lot of listeners into everybody can interpret the Bible. Everybody has the power to read Scripture. And then what's happened is you do have a plethora of ideas. And just, I mean, even today, you look at scholarship on the book of James, there's hundreds of commentaries that are somewhat in agreement and they diverge from each other. Who's right and who's wrong? Well, you, the reader, decides who's right and who's wrong by choosing which ones you're going to read. That's why I always encourage people, and this doesn't really answer your question, Paul, fully, but just why a little advertisement. If you have a particular commentator that you read, let's say you all read N.T. Wright stuff, I would encourage you to go read somebody totally different on the other end of the spectrum, just to get out of your bubble, just to really get out of your bubble. Even if you throw it down and burn it in your fireplace at Christmas time, go do it just to broaden your horizons, because we do live in that environment, which is completely different than James's environment. For James, there was a teacher, and clearly I tend to agree with scholars, there probably was some other teacher that showed up to this community and taught something very different than James did. And James is trying to fix that and now say, I am the teacher. You shall listen to me. Because they were dependent upon the teachers to teach. So yes, even in the early church, you had a pluralistic opinions, but the church came together and decided on some major doctrinal things and basically set the field up. And then everybody had to stay in the field or you were considered a heretic. So there was room, but there wasn't extreme variation in Christian thought. Does that make sense, Paul? Does that help a little bit or no? Because I'm not entirely sure you like what I'm saying, but I like that you said that, though. Makes me feel good. What else? Anybody else have any thoughts? Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, my Bible had a note about that James' point might have been that people that teach better be sure that what they're saying is backed up by what they do. And that's where he may have been going with that comment about teachers being judged to a stricter standard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let me just tie up, and then we can keep talking. Let me just, since we only have a few verses to the end, let me just tie this up real quick. So then the last part of this is under the banner of two kinds of wisdom, you might call it. This is verse 13 through 18. And I'm reading from the NIV right now. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. If you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. A lot of scholarship tends to think that this is the description of the penultimate teacher. To Phil's point, do your deeds reflect what you're teaching? But this note about wisdom is really important here, because wisdom in James, we believe, given his way of talking about language and that Jewish understanding of wisdom, wisdom isn't something you gain. It is something given by God. We can go all the way back to Solomon. Solomon was granted wisdom. He was a wise king. One might say that with James believes we all have access to that wisdom, that we all have wisdom pouring through. Not to quote Paul with James, but let's just go with it. By the grace of God, we all have wisdom passing through us by virtue of God. And we live in humility, and we don't seek our own personal gain, which is hard. It's really hard to do. We all want to build ourselves up. That we then are truly becoming the teacher, because once we're humble and we're tuned into that wisdom, it's not about having the right answers. It's about sowing those seeds of peace. It's about putting God's great design into action of building community and building faithful disciples who are willing to go out and talk about God. We're willing to be peace-loving. We're willing to be considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, as James would say. And then we sow that peace into the harvest. And some would say that is James's way of saying, this is the teacher. This is the teacher you should listen to. One who doesn't put themselves so out in front, but someone who doesn't pretend to have all the answers, who's learning constantly, who wants to grow with the people they're gathered with, and that believes that we're going to learn more together than we are apart. And potentially that might be how you overcome the, Paul, to your earlier question, that may be how you overcome the plurality of opinions and ideas that are permeating within Christian thought, really since the Reformation, when the field really expanded, one might say. So that kind of wraps up chapter 3, so we can continue our conversation, but I wanted to throw that out there after Phil's comment. It's a nice tie-in. What else are y'all thinking?
I was struck by find my glasses here. I was drawn to the words on the elucidation on the second page. James points out that our speech reflects the state of our heart. That's that makes it pretty serious, or brings seriousness to my understanding of the importance of choosing my words carefully.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I think we all have that. And I will say too, also for all of us to think about, although y'all are practicing this very well, listening before we talk, not being quick to speak and listening. And I think there's some important, there's an emphasis on that. And that's how we would craft our speech. Again, from that place of humility, that I don't have all the answers, that I really don't have it all figured out. But I think together we'll figure it out. Again, it goes back to what maybe what I said at the very beginning. How might I understand this, whatever this is? Help me understand this. Help me understand your position. Help me understand this situation. Help me understand blank. To come at it that way versus you're crazy, and here's why you're crazy. I'm not going to listen to a word you said, and the whole time you're talking, I'm going to be formulating a defensive answer back. And this guy has struggled with that his whole life. I'll be vulnerable and admit that right publicly here on this recorded Zoom call. And maybe some of you have had that struggle too. It's hard. And James makes no bones about it. Go ahead, Carol.
That is one of the reasons what I think got more from the TASE classes than anything else, because in those classes, you have to listen because there is no time for rebuttal. So you learn to listen to what the other person is saying, not thinking about, oh, well, they said this, and well, I'm going to say this. You just listen to what they're saying. And that has been a beautiful experience for me. Not an easy one to keep my mouth shut, but I really have learned more to listen to people than thinking about what I'm going to say back about what they have said.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's the reason I think the TASE classes are an exceedingly valuable tool for anyone who wants just to learn. So.
And for the record, I'm excited that Parker Jameson is back teaching a foundations TASE class. Just some folks who've never experienced TASE.
Yeah.
So
good.
that's starting soon. Anybody else? We're going to switch to prayer here soon. Anybody have any final thoughts, questions, comments?
Father, I want to reiterate your words of the importance of teaching by example. As a parent and a grandparent, it just becomes such an invaluable tool, you know, to do, as you say, you're going to teach, because the children are the most, they see and say everything that you're doing, and they bring you up to the table. When I try to say something that, you know, I'm trying to teach Jackson, my little 7-year-old grandson. And so it's not easy, but it is really the best lesson, you know, by teaching them by example, how you live your life, how you treat granddad, how you treat him, how you treat others, the vocabulary that you use, and etc. So it is invaluable to me.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? Alrighty, folks, I'm going to stop the recording and we'll do our prayers.